So I'm going to talk a bit about our next panel as they get set up on stage. Our next panel in our symposium today looks at the growing challenges of governing in Texas communities. The nationalization of local politics has brought suspicion to how local governments operate, whether it's related to voting, public education, and more. We want to sit down with Texas public leaders who have been directly impacted by this trend. So I thank our panelists for joining us up on stage. I know a few of us are getting settled again. I would ask if you can be as quiet as possible so we can stay on schedule. Very ambitious schedule today with a number of panels, but democracy is a big topic. So grateful for our panel. So let's get to know our panel. Ector County Judge Dustin Fawcett is a sixth-generation Texan and a proud Odessan. From Washington, D.C. to Austin and throughout the Permian Basin, Fawcett has been on the front lines of public policy advocacy for the better half of a decade. He took office in January of 2023, and his passions in policy include transportation, criminal justice, mental health, and economic development. Tiffanie Harrison serves as a Round Rock ISD trustee and board vice president. She spent just shy of a decade as a high school marketing teacher in Round Rock ISD. She is passionate about racial and educational equity and leads innovation efforts with the Black Parents and Families Collective, and is also the Collective Equity Officer and co-CEO for the National Health Equity Collective. John B. Muns became Plano's 40th mayor on May 10th, 2021. Prior to becoming mayor, he served the Plano community in many capacities, including chair of the Planning and Zoning and serving on the Economic Development Board. Muns also served on the Plano Independent School District Board as a trustee for 16 years, with 3 of those years as president. And our moderator, Pooja Salhotra, is general assignment reporter for the Texas Tribune, covering issues ranging from breaking news to developments in state agencies. She joined the Tribune in 2022 as its first ever East Texas reporter based in Lufkin, where she covered a vast region that borders 3 states and stretches north to Texarkana and south to Beaumont. And with that, I turn the program over to my colleague, Pooja.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I think we have the coveted position of standing between you all and lunch, so we'll do our best to be engaging. So one of the starkest examples, I think, of national politics entering local governments has been in education. We've seen across the country a number of school board races having an infusion of funding in a way that they don't typically have, and we've seen fights on school boards between parents. So I wanted to start with Trustee Harrison. The Texas Tribune covered your election back in November, and it was a pretty heated race. And can you talk a little bit to us about what the issues were on the school board leading up to that election and how things stand now?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Yes. Hyperpartisanship played a heavy role in our elections in Round Rock ISD, and we saw national issues brought into our school district around things like book bans, which Round Rock ISD has an exemplar policy around evaluating books, around book curriculum. And so we saw a lot of those issues coming in, parents' rights, right? Pitting parents against public school districts, having parents wanting to decide about other children's education and access. So we saw a lot of that, and we saw a lot of contention, and it was a very difficult race. It was surprisingly a dangerous race. Lots of threats of violence and violent actions. But our community rose up, and our community came together and voted in 5 candidates that are pro-public education, pro-student. So the hyperpartisanship had been happening for 2 years since I had been elected the first time. And it was just really interesting that our community in a nonpartisan election still really voted across partisan lines and came together and said, we don't want that violent extremism in our community. I won't say that things are perfect now, but I will say that they have stabilized and we're focusing on students and we're able to focus on student outcomes.
Great. And then Mayor Muns, you are in Plano, which is not too far from South Lake, where it was the subject of an NBC podcast that kind of made the town a symbol of these debates around critical race theory. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how that coverage has affected Plano, if and how. And I know we talked a little bit about economic development, so if you can touch on that.
Sure. Thank you for allowing us to be here. We have had similar issues in the ISDs that Trustee Harrison was just speaking of. So there was, I can remember when I ran for mayor just 3 years ago, at some of the forums, it was literally just then that it was brought up on some news channels about critical race theory. And several of us, and I spent 16 years on the PISD school board, and quite frankly, we all looked at each other because they just referred it as CRT. And we were all kind of searching to try to figure out what does that stand for? We're not even sure what that is. And so over that next year, it became, a common, a discussion point in the community. And then along with it came book bans. And so we've dealt with those as well. We watch the news just like you do, and we see what's going on in South Lake, and we certainly don't have that kind of environment in Plano, but it's something that we're very concerned about. One of the things that Plano is well known for is our corporate community and the companies that exist in Plano. And I can tell you that the issues that are occurring in Austin in regard to funding, fully funding our ISDs and talking about vouchers and things like that, those are not good for economic development. And when we talk about the companies that are there, they want a safe and secure environment, they want good education, and they want an educated workforce. And those three are referred to by companies all over the world. And so if we don't have those, then we're really vulnerable to losing those companies down the road.
And speaking of what's going on in Austin and how that affects you, Judge Fawcett, what are some of the ways that legislation that occurred this past session in Austin, how that has affected your ability to govern Ector County?
Sure. So thank you for having me here today. This is a massive topic that I frequently talk about. We talked about it last week. We had our VG Young conference with all of our county commissioners and county judges across the state. And what the legislature does each year is, or every other year, supposed to be in those 140 days that have now turned to 260 and everything else that they're doing. It massively impacts our ability as local governments to really run local governments. You think about it, there's 4 county commissioners, 1 county judge in every single county in 254 counties. You think of how many city council members there are across the state. You're talking thousands. You talk about school board members, trustees, thousands. You're talking county commissioners, over 1,000. You're talking about hospital districts, thousands. You're talking about municipal utility districts, thousands. But there's only 181 elected officials statewide between the Senate and the House that dictate specifically what we can do. Now, Mayor Muns, you have a little bit more freedom as cities because y'all can do anything that the legislature doesn't say you can't do, whereas us as counties can only explicitly do what the Texas legislature gives us the ability to do. But a major thing that we've seen in recent years is in this war against local governments is the best personification is in whenever I have to read my budget, the budget statement that I have to read whenever we pass our budget, and it is a flat out lie that I have to say to my constituents. We left our tax rate alone this year. It was 35 cents the past year per $100 valuation. We left it alone, the exact same tax rate. Yet the statement that I have to read to my voters is that this is a 19% tax rate increase because our taxable value jumped up. And it wasn't because home values increased. Actually, the average home value in Ector County dropped by $17,000. So on average, the average Ector County homeowner was going to save $56 to $60. I didn't say that. I had to lie to my constituents and tell them that it's going to increase. And then I go on to the second part of that statement and lie again and say the average $100,000 home is going to have to pay $56 more a year. Well, that type of lying to the citizens then goes to them and saying, well, you're passing this increase, yada, yada. And it goes back to the same debate that we face as local government officials in setting a tax rate, that we talk about these no new revenue rates, what used to be the effective rate, which means that you pass a tax rate that is the same as your previous year. Well, many local government officials, and especially my party, the Republicans, they get caught in this, that I have to pass a no new revenue tax rate. Well, there is nothing more regressive for a community than not to be budgeting for population plus inflation. And how do you plan for a growing and developing community in a state that is growing astronomically, and you're passing a regressive tax rate? And then voters come to you and say, why can't we build roads? Why can't we perform basic functions? Why does your courthouse not have a functioning elevator? Why do I smell these nasty smells? We have no money in the coffers, and it is a case study for over-conservatism, and it's because of these national politics. Are you a Trump Republican, or are you this? No, I ran as a solution-oriented Republican, because the identity of what a conservative Republican is, what does that mean? Does it mean I can rattle off a Bible verse to you at any given time? Sure, I can do that, but what does that mean about the judicial system? What does it mean about county roads? We are less than 4% of the statewide population in the Permian Basin, but we're 15% of the commercial motor vehicle fatal crashes. That's a problem that needs a solution, and that's government that needs to solve that. Who cares what you think? What's your favorite Bible verse in government? It's what are you going to do to save our people? We have a community in West Odessa we'll talk about in a little bit that needs tremendous amounts of help. And what I think about the war in Ukraine is totally irrelevant to providing water to over 80,000 citizens. So I can keep going on, but what the legislature does is making us lie to our citizens over this. It's a lack of accountability at the statewide level, and they pass the buck on to local governments, and that's really the gist of what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think one of the examples, Mayor Muns, that we talked about is in the last legislative session, they passed this quote-unquote Death Star bill that preempts local governments from passing laws that kind of overlap with state regulations. So can you share any examples of maybe how that would affect you?
Sure. I couldn't agree with you more, Judge. We are a local government that gets more done at the local level than any state and federal government entity. So I will tell you, we get things done at the local level. And that's what I think when the previous panel was talking about voting, that's the real sad thing, is really most people focus on the state and federal level and rarely kind of focus in on what's happening in your own area. The preemption bill that was passed is basically a bill that says you cannot create an ordinance that's more restrictive than the state ordinance. Now that sounds logical at that point, but it does really bind. I mean, there's some issues in the preemption bill for a city in Plano that we really don't have a whole lot of farmland left. And so here's this preemption bill that for just a 1 or 2% of farmland, we cannot have an ordinance that provides an opportunity for development or whatever that is, if it's overly required past the state restrictions. And it becomes a real problem. And I think one of the problems that you have in the state government is they want to paint a broad brush all across the state. And all of us have unique differences in how our community is, how our corporate community is, and what we want in a quality of life. And that becomes very restrictive. And just like the judge said a minute ago, we continue to lose our local control, no more than the school districts in Texas. That has been happening for the last 25 years. And that has been a real problem with recapture, and now it's become, in Plano, recapture is now over $2 billion that we've sent back to the state. And that has become a real problem. And now that funding is not being delivered to the districts because of politics, it's really become a problem.
Yeah, so speaking of public school finance, we'll pass it over to Trustee Harrison. But before you get into the finance piece, one thing that was mentioned on a previous panel was the HISD takeover and how that has actually galvanized students around politics and getting involved. I know that Round Rock ISD had seen something similar in the past, and we're seeing just more examples of TEA coming in and taking control of school districts. So talk a little bit about what happened and how does that affect you and your ability to govern?
Absolutely. So Round Rock ISD had a TEA monitor for 18 months. And part of that was that we were unclear about the policy around monitorship. That monitorship should not have extended beyond a year. And what that does is it takes the focus away from students, it takes the focus away from staff. It causes us to use public dollars and resources to pay for and support that monitor. And we lose local control, as we're seeing in HISD, as we're also seeing in AISD. There's even a larger context to this when we are talking about testing and evaluation. Right now, mid-year, there's a change in our evaluation system that has been stayed by the courts for this time. But that confuses students, that confuses educators, that confuses parents. How do they know the quality of the schools that they're attending when we're not comparing apples to apples in rating systems? You have third graders going to completely online test, a complete transformation from how they were previously being evaluated. So what is that doing to their classroom learning and to the process of teaching and learning? And this is in a time where we are losing teachers by the day, right? So much of public education, I can say this because I came straight from the classroom to the boardroom in 2020. So much of public education is predicated on the free labor of educators. We're not paying them enough. And the loss of local control and the focus on what we need to do to hire and retain strong educators, to do what we know to do by our community and knowing our communities, is disrupting public education, and we're seeing that on a very large scale.
And then I want to pull a question from Matthew on the previous panel and just kind of flipping this to more of a solutions angle of what would you have liked to see the state do and kind of what can you advocate for in the coming sessions that would make a difference? This is for each of you. You can start.
I think the answer is clear that we need to fully fund public education. And the defunding of public education and the attempts at vouchers are a partisan way of shifting the narrative of the effectiveness of public education. It's hard to be effective when you're not funded. It's hard to retain those experienced educators when we're not funded. It's hard to do that when we are experiencing additionally unfunded mandates around having an armed person on every campus or around reading academies, which is a great thing. It's great to strengthen the praxis of reading around teaching and learning. But this is anywhere from 70 to 150 hours of additional labor that is uncompensated for educators. So if and when we fully fund public education, which we have the money to do, we have the funds to pay educators and increase, their salaries in line with the cost of living. We have educators living at or below the poverty level. We are doing things that are solution-oriented in spite of what's happening at the Texas legislature around providing affordable housing for educators. Educators hold our future in their hands. And what we need to be doing is fully funding education and raising the basic allotment.
I love what you're saying, and I think that a huge misnomer in all of government and everything else is the fact that we're not focusing on the fact that humans are your greatest asset. And that's something that we pushed at locally. I got a 20% raise for jailers, which are a similar thing in law enforcement to teachers, that we're seeing people leave. And part of it is salaries. A large part of it is what the public's perception is of law enforcement or of teachers and of what's happening. I think that the fact that TEA is going outside of their bounds is indicative of what the state government's doing, the federal government, all of them. No one's staying in their lane and doing their job. But TEA, Ector County ISD, just joined a lawsuit recently against TEA because they put out their accountability measures 6 months into the school year. That's unacceptable, but it goes back to what can we do to fix this, the level of governance in our state. And one is start focusing on good government and not on not on partisan politics. We obsess over politics and not on good governance. And we need to be looking at a reformation of how we fund things in the state. What state agency is really working well? Is TEA working well? No. The Secretary of State, whenever I have election questions of my local elections, one of our utility districts, I call the Secretary of State's office and I have to leave a voicemail, push 1, 2, or 3, and leave a voicemail. Whenever they respond to me with an email, it has their general number, which is whatever, VOTE. I can't have a direct line to them over an actual election, the citizens' rights, civil rights to have a free and fair election. What state agency is really running well? You'd think of that in the state, but what local governments are running well? A lot. And what we need to do is look at changing the funding formulas. You look at how much of the state receives in sales tax, 6.25% of the 8.25%. They leave 2% to us locals. And they want to talk about lowering property tax. Well, I have a proposition. Decrease your 6.25 to 5%, give that 1.25% to me as Ector County, and we would have no property tax coming from Ector County. You look at then maybe perhaps increasing the total state share up to 10%. The state share is 5%. The rest of the local governments can increase that 1.75. You start looking at that, and you can reduce property tax burdens in my community, and I'm sure it's everywhere else, by upwards of 60 to 70%. And then you can fill that rest of that 30% with the rest of the fees. My tax assessor collector, we handle all of the vehicle registrations for the state, but we get a 5% commission on all of the things that we send down to the state for all of your license plates, your registration, and everything else. I fund my county government, my taxpayers fund that vehicle registration process, but the state collects 95% of it. Why do local taxpayers have to fund this staff, send that money off to a centralized government? And we're ran by Republicans, right? Aren't we against a centralized government? If Democrats were in power, I guarantee Republicans would be all over this. But what we're seeing is it's not about Republicanism or Democrats. It's about control. And our party is as guilty of it as anybody. It's about control and invading with your ideals and pushing rather than letting the free market of ideas. School vouchers is government subsidy for private industry. Isn't that very antithetical to Republican ideals of a free market of education? And we're going to be manipulating the markets of these private schools. They're just going to increase. Okay, we're going to give them $6,100 a year. Okay, we'll raise it by $6,100. Thanks, state. What are we doing? And it's a goofy conversation. We're not talking about actually solving problems anywhere in the state. And in our local elections, we're not talking about actually what counties do or what cities do. I'm sure you had questions on the campaign trail about. I had it about border security, or what are you going to do about illegal immigration? These things are not within my purview, but what is? ESDs, emergency services, better roads, criminal justice reform. Having a Texas juvenile justice system that is fractured at the state level, I'm trying to fix it at my local level. They had a $30+ billion surplus at the state. I tried to get $40 million for a new juvenile justice facility to work with Midland County. We had $25 million on the plate. We had surrounding counties all going to contribute. A local solution, $30+ billion surplus. Hey, that $40 million out there, that's just too much to solve a problem. And TJJD is a broken system. We had a juvenile who had 38 felonies who we sent off to the state system, to TJJD. They, with no notification, paroled him, sent him back into our community. We only found out about it when he committed an additional 4 felonies, had a state trooper's AR-15 on Instagram Live showing it off. You know, that's a failure of another state agency. So why do they have all the money when it's us who are hurting and we take the brunt of it?
Mayor Muns?
Well, I couldn't agree. So more, we really expect the state government to focus on roads, healthcare, and education. Those are the 3 areas that they're really supposed to put the bulk of their budget back into the state. And like the judge just said, we have so many problems with getting into the weeds, really just pushing all the issues down to the local level without that funding. We've been partnering with our ISD on school resource officers for years. And now that they mandated that we have officers in every school, that would add an additional 55 more officers. And so that budget of $1.5 billion sounds like a lot, but when you're talking about 7 million kids all across the state, that doesn't even come close to what's required to pay good trained officers or something equivalent to that for every single school. Once again, we're trying to team up with our school district so that we can kind of alleviate a lot of the costs that go along with it, but at the same time, it affects our budget as well. And so we need the state to really focus on what they are required constitutionally to do. And those 3 things, along with a few others, have really been neglected over the last decade.
Judge Fawcett, you mentioned that part of your territory includes West Odessa, which is an unincorporated community. My colleague Carlos in the region has covered it. And that means that they have no city council. They're basically only subject to state and federal laws. So Judge Fawcett has tried to foster a relationship with them, but has, at least based on our reporting last year, been met with some skepticism and kind of some distrust of government, which is part of what we're discussing here. So what is like the response that you're getting from that community in terms of, are they trusting of you or not? And how are you navigating that?
Yes, it's an incredible endeavor, and I absolutely love the challenge. It was one that when I first brought it up to my fellow commissioners court before I got on the commissioners court, they laughed in my face. You're going to go out there. One, these folks moved out there because they didn't want government interfering with them to an extent, the old school. But there's not many registered voters. And so no county judge in our history has ever gone out there. We're talking arguably 80 to 100,000 people in a metropolitan area, the 3rd largest city in West Texas in the Permian Basin, until you go north to Lubbock, east to Abilene, southeast to San Angelo, west to El Paso, with no form of government, 1 volunteer fire department. And these folks, in this whole area, we have 5,800 homes hooked up to water. A majority of these folks are taking these giant tubs built for the oil and gas industry for retaining chemicals. They go fill them up at the local station full of water, and they go fill up a water tank, and that's what they use. And so they have no water, of course, no broadband. Education out there is at an all-time low. 80% of these adults read below a 6th grade reading level. It's a huge challenge. And so when I went out there for a town hall to talk about the concept of incorporating into their own town, there was a lot of fear over being annexed by the city. And that difference between incorporating into your own city versus annexation was massive. So we had over 115 people show up, and they were ready to take my head off. And I knew it. I had a presentation prepared. I told my staff, no way. I said, first 30 minutes, bear with me. It's going to look scary, but we're going to get through it. And in fact, our sheriff's deputies called for backup. They thought I was going to get taken out. But after that first 30 minutes, first I had to hear concerns that dated back 30 years. I haven't seen my commissioner out here grading my alley. Well, we got off the precinct system 30 years, so that sounds appropriate. Our hospital district, yada, yada. Well, Ector County's not in charge of the hospital anymore. That's a different system that happened about 30 years ago as well. Oh, I moved out of the city. I don't want to be annexed. Well, we're not talking about you annexing. We're talking about you creating your own government. And you know what's great is, even the most radical Americans who are anti-government, who broke away from the British government, did what? They created a government, right? They understood that we have a baseline foundation of needs, the most common denominator among all of us, and you need a government to do that. Otherwise, we live in a state of nature, like Hobbes says, and you need a government, as Locke says, for protection of life, liberty, and essentially property. And we're not doing that. And so we broke through. It took about 2 hours. And by the end of it, I said, by a raise of hand, how many of you are interested in continuing this conversation about emergency service districts and about incorporation? Unanimous hands. Because they all knew somebody who had fallen down or had cardiac arrest whose life wasn't saved. And that's the human side of it. That's what government is. And that's what I told them. It's not about these silly things or about zoning or anything else. We're talking about baseline foundational forms of government, back to the foundations. And that's what we've lost is the foundational cake. We care more, we talk more in the news and the media about the cherries and the whipped cream and argue who wants pecans and all these silly political things. Government's about the base ingredients of what makes up that cake of a society, and they have none out there. And we are losing people, and in our region more than ever in the Permian Basin because of the oil and gas industry that helps fund this region in Harris County due to the ports and LNG and everything else, and due to the finance sector in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We run the state. $4 billion plus in oil and gas severance tax gets sent down to the state every year. We fund a majority of that. So what we do in my community is massively important because we need to double our workforce in the next 30 years to keep up with the demands and the world trends. And sorry to break it to a lot of you folks who are pro-renewables, and I am, but we need hydrocarbons for the next century. You look at Shell studies, BP studies, and we're leading the charge on the next generation of oil and gas. We have the largest in the world direct air capture plant being built in my county, in western Ector County. We're leading the charge on carbon sequestration. We're doing those things, but also we will continue. We live in the petroleum age, ladies and gentlemen. You think back of the Bronze Age and all these great ages. We live in the petroleum age. Everything that we use is plastics. We use fuels, and the transition to these other energy sources is not coming at a rate. You cannot manufacture it in a different way. And so what we do in our region, what we do in West Odessa, with this 80,000 population, I need them to be in the workforce. I don't need them to be running their own childcare facilities and having our kindergarten readiness not prepared. Over 56% of my employees have a family member running their childcare. It's something I'm looking to seek a solution for and partnering with Dr. Muri at ECISD. We're seeking these solutions because we all have to work together on these solutions. But that's what's vital in government. The role of government is these baseline things to bring it up to where these folks can go out and work. Because if you don't have running water in your home, and you're in a trailer among 8 other trailers on a half-acre plot like in West Odessa, and you have no internet, no anything else, how good of an education are those kids going to be? If they don't have food at the home, the only meal they get is at lunch, and we provide free lunch in Ector County ISD, how efficient or effective is their schooling going to be? And so that's why these basic foundations of government are vitally important. So I don't get to talk about, is your county going to be a sanctuary county? I have no worries about that. I have real problems to face.
Yeah, so you talked about kind of working in some ways across the aisle and with folks with kind of a huge amount of distrust of you and of just government in general, and maybe finding some common ground. So I'm curious for Trustee Harrison, you have been on a school board where people with diametrically opposed views are sitting in the same room at sometimes till 3 a.m. talking about how to educate children. So what have been some of the ways that you've been able to find common ground and actually get things done?
I think being in community. So one charge that I undertook was two-way communication with our community, because we hear these national ideas. We see the presence of organizations like Moms for Liberty, and they're trying to take a very national lens and focus. And there's a difference when we're in the community and we're talking to parents and students and families. And what we're hearing are very basic things, right? We want our students to be able to read. We want our students to be able to do math, and we want them to feel safe and welcome in their schools. And so simplifying these conversations, I think there will always be a level of extremism. And what I've had to personally learn with two of my colleagues on my school board, there's not going to be points of convergence or points of interest when your goal is to disrupt. So how do we quiet that noise and refocus our energy on students? How do we convene with parents, students, educators, and hear what's actually important to the people that are living the life through public education, and how do we advance that work and quiet the other noise? And that has really been key to our progress. And I will say 5 of 7 of my colleagues, we do work across the aisle. We don't have the same personal political beliefs, but what we believe is that each and every student under our charge and under our care has the ability and the capacity to learn, and that we are actually a well-resourced district for all of the struggling with funding. We're a well-resourced district that has caring educators and a welcoming community that wants to serve our students well. And so we've had to reground and refocus on what's important, and that's been the same thing for our local business community, for our chamber. We've had to shut out the noise, and we've had to realize when people aren't being intellectually honest with how they are trying to cause confusion. And that's a really hard thing. I think that there's often conversation about everyone coming to the table. Everyone won't come to the table. And you have to acknowledge that let's bring in the people who will. Let's bring in the people who can center the power of public education in our case and center the care of children, and let's move forward together. And that is working. That's working.
Mayor Muns, is there anything that you've seen in your community that has been effective in kind of navigating all the limitations that the state has put in terms of limits on local control, unfunded mandates? What have you done to be able to still get work done in Plano?
Well, every single day, communication is vital to every community that exists. We've just been talking about it. And that's always the biggest challenge as well, is to make sure you are communicating with your community in regard to those amenities and resources that everyone comes to expect, whether it's clean water, whether it's making sure the trash is picked up on a regular basis, making sure that we have police officers in areas all across Plano, developing those relationships so that they can almost prevent issues from happening because they're already out there and they're recognized in these neighborhoods. And so, just as I said earlier, the things that people care most about is being safe and secure, making sure that they live in a good education environment, and at the same time, making sure that we have people available to perform and work in the companies that we provide or that we attract to Plano. And it may sound simple, but it's something that we talk about every single day, because without those things, your community shrinks and dries up and goes away.
So transitioning a little bit, we are in the middle of an election right now, and Judge Fawcett, the day that I called you last week to prepare for this panel, you had just delivered a press conference because there had been an altercation at a polling place between two candidates. And one of the things that you said was that during the press conference to another reporter is that we've seen an elevated temperature. I would be lying if I said this wasn't expected. Can you share a little bit about what, in your view, is causing this elevated temperature that I don't think is unique to Ector County by any means, but that's just one example that happened last week. So tell us what is going on, and what did you mean when you said it was in some ways expected?
I think it's palpable to voters, the frustration with all politics, government. They don't feel that there's anything they can do. They may not like the candidates. They don't know the solutions because no one's talking about solutions. They're talking about one another. And they would rather fight against a person rather than fight for a solution, than fight for, what's best for a community. But then also the language that we use in elections. One is fighting against them. And one of our party members put out a mailer and she's got on these boxing gloves. Well, of course we're going to have a fight at the polls. And we did among two grandmothers. We're better than this. But the language that we use, and this particular fight came about because they're both on the Republican primary ticket, but one was saying that the other one's a Democrat and a socialist, and how dare she? How dare she? But what is a Republican anymore? That's why I ran as a solution-oriented Republican, because what is that? What is conservative? People would ask me, well, what are you conservative? Well, does that mean that I'm going to lower your tax rate artificially and then set our community back another decade? Especially if oil and gas drops and then our taxable value leaves. That's poor policy. No, I'm not going to do that. And so the nomenclature, the words that we use anymore is, what is liberal? Well, I'm a classical liberal. As I quoted John Locke, classical liberalism. We've lost what these words mean in government. We're not talking about real things or ideas. We're talking about people. We're not talking about policy, and it's disheartening. And so the temperature gets elevated because people don't have an avenue to vent that, and they are frustrated. The legislature who they elect for certain things tell them that, well, we have nothing we can do on property tax because that's collected at your local level. But in every single state race mailer that I've seen or campaign ad, we lowered your property taxes. Well, what else is in those mailers and in their ads? We protected the border. Well, that's also not a Texas constitutional thing. I mean, it arguably is now with some of what's going on. But, that everybody's getting outside of their lane. The ambiguity in government means, where do you go? And so it's just this frustration. And so it goes all the way down to precinct races. That's what this one was. And how silly, but it is so visceral because it's the other. And we heard a lot of it on the previous panels, and I don't like identity politics. It's a symptom of an overly political science, and I'm a political science major, but we put everybody in categories. 18 to 25, 25 to 35. Where do I fit in that? I'm 33, but what am I? Am I conservative? Are you this or that? What is your label? Are you this? And we don't talk about ideas. We talk about who that person is on the outside or where they grew up or all of these other things. We're not talking about ideas anymore. Where's your mind at? And that saddens me. But I'm also very hopeful that I think that we need a reformation. I'm a Lutheran by religion. I think that the Protestant Reformation was the greatest thing to happen in the Western world because it changed a lot of things. But I felt the same way as Luther did when he went down to the Vatican as a true believer in Catholicism, and he saw what was happening. It was the same way when I worked in the legislature and on budget night, passing a $200+ billion budget, and it was a giant party like a church lock-in. Everybody's running around with their shoes off, getting drunk, singing karaoke. We're passing a $200 billion state budget, and the staff's acting like a bunch of monkeys. That's unacceptable. And we're not serious in government anymore. And, it saddens me, but also the pendulum can only swing so far before it swings back. And that's where I'm an eternal optimist. And if we can lead it at the local level, then I think it'll catch on in a much larger level.
So one of the statistics I saw is that a number of local races, there's no opponent. There's just one person running. And I'm curious if, Mayor Muns, Trustee Harrison, all of you, if you've seen people feeling less inclined to run for office, given things like a fight breaking out at a polling place or, getting threats when you're running for office. Are you seeing that, and are you doing any work to kind of motivate people to get out there and get involved?
Well, I talk about local elections because is for us, for at least Ms. Harrison and I, we're in nonpartisan races, and so it's very difficult. I mean, there is not a day that you don't run for this office or her office that somebody says, "Are you an R or a D?" That's all they need to know. They don't need any more information than that, and that qualifies my personality, my temperament, my conservatism, whatever it is. Just two letters make all the difference in the world on how to evaluate somebody. And you know, I would say it also is a pendulum. Right? There have been times that city council has been just really the attention has all gone to the city council, and the school board is fairly quiet and under the radar. It seems like in the last few years, the school board races have been a whole lot more contentious than the city council. But of course, you know, once you throw short-term rentals into the mix or these kind of issues, then it becomes back on the city council. I think I'm right in the heart of the Attorney General's home, and the governor and the Attorney General have probably been working North Texas in Collin County so much because there's this ridiculous fighting going on about whether or not you tried to impeach me or whether or not you didn't vote for the school vouchers. And so we have this, and the fight is going on at the top of the state level, and it's affecting these races all across the state because they have chosen their candidate for their particular interest, and the governor's done the same thing. And so it has become somewhat chaotic in these primaries, and the primaries have gotten uglier and uglier, and they cannot go any farther right to outright the opponent. And so it's become really frustrating for us as voters to experience that, knowing what we know is the responsibility of the state legislature, and it's just so far from what their real responsibilities are. So I feel like there's been more attention to some of the local races in the last few years, and I think it has a lot to do with the politics of the state and federal level, and they want to bring it down to the local level, and then they realize it has nothing to do with those issues.
Yeah. Trustee Harrison, I want to let you chime in, and then we'll move into audience questions. So feel free to start lining up if you have questions.
Absolutely. So people have asked, what is my goal for my second term? And it's really to make school board boring again. The people that need to be elected are often intimidated out of running. I've run at incredible, personal sacrifice. I had to quit my job as a teacher. It has revolutionized my life in terms of my personal safety. There are places that I don't go alone. I have increased my level of security. So it's really hard for me to look at someone, especially somebody that is marginalized and may not always be represented in government, and say, you need to run, because I know the cost. But I also know what it takes to support someone that should be representing. And I would like to see, when my term is up, a working parent get elected. And I would like to see them be able to come to our board meetings at 5:30 and be home by 8, right? Our statutorily required business as school board members could be taken care of in 2.5 hours for the entire year. Yet there have been times where we spent 11, 12 hours in meetings, and that's not sustainable. And the bulk of what we were discussing had nothing to do with students or student outcomes. And so I really think the future is to know what our role is and to stay in that role, and to also help educate our community about what they're asking us to do and what they've elected us to do. First of all, children are not red or blue. So when we're caught in these hyper-partisan fights, we're not serving them well. That's number one. But number two, when our community understands the role of the school board, my role is not to hire your football coach. I mean, that sounds great, and I know you'd love to influence that. But then you need to become a campus principal. You don't need to become a school board member. And when I put what we're doing in context and in the context of serving and supporting students and making sure that we have strong education so that we have a strong future, I do believe that's going to make school board boring again, and make it more accessible to the people who should be representing.
This looks like we have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Alexia Aguilar. I'm a student at the University of Houston. My question was, so as we talk about vouchers and public education reform, where do you think the role of a charter school system plays? And do you think that charter schools are a threat to our public education system?
I know you're looking at me. I think that charter schools are born out of a need for innovation. I think that they do serve certain students well, but once again, that's not a broad, public schools serve everyone, right? Public schools serve students that are accessing and need special education support and services, but I look at charter schools targeting particularly Black and brown students and families, and not offering the protection of students being able to stay in that school with disciplinary records, right? And so it's not an overarching approach. There is not accountability, but I do think that their ability to be more nimble is a threat to public education, especially while we are underfunding public education. And so I honestly think that's a strategy, though, right? If we have this shiny charter school over here and public schools are struggling, it is a strategy born out of innovation and necessity. So it's a really complex conversation. Yeah.
I want to throw in one plug, just in the school choice debate, or it's not even so much the vouchers, but in ECISD, we have 10 different elementary schools that are magnets. We have an international baccalaureate for a middle school, and then at the high school level, we have a CTE program. We partner with Odessa College for an early high school or early college high school program, then also another one with OCA, and then UTPB, University of Texas Permian Basin. We have another choice for kids to go to. And so we are creating those pathways for students in a number of different ways, and I think that's the model for the state. And Governor Abbott, threw out something in the state of his state about our programs at OC and all of that. And so I think that's more so the model than let's quit funding here and look at the shiny new object, as you said. There's better models.
Go ahead.
Good morning. Catherine Myers, also with the Hobby School. My question is also about education, but early education. The federal government considers spending less than 7% of your income on childcare to be affordable, but most Texans spend significantly more than that. What solutions do you see at the local level to help parents afford to send their kids to quality daycare so they can work?
I can speak to that, and that is partnership. One thing that we've been testing in Round Rock ISD is partnership with local organizations. So we have pre-K3, we have full day pre-K3, and what that allows is access, especially for teachers' children, and we would like to have universal pre-K3 because that's important. So what we're doing is partnering with existing childcare centers, providing them with a fully licensed teacher or two for those pre-K3 programs, and that's also a level and a measure of economic development and supporting those childcare centers. So that's vitally important when we talk about early literacy. That is key, and that is a local solution that we've developed, but we would love to see broader statewide solution and support for early literacy.
Yeah, I think partnerships are absolutely vital. We have an amazing organization out in the Permian Basin called the Permian Strategic Partnership, and it's the 22 major oil and gas companies, and they have a number of pillars. One of them is quality of place, roads, and so on. But one of their initiatives is childcare, and it's one that I've been on top of for a while because we see folks leaving, especially in our clerk level, leaving because they have that second kid, and the cost of daycare for two children is the equivalent of what their income is going to be while working in my clerk's office. And so we are actively partnering with our school district. We're looking at one of the elementary schools now. And then another route that we can look at is as officials is the now we can provide not a homestead exemption, but similar to it, a local option to provide in 50 to 100% property tax relief for childcare facilities. And so we have a number of those that we're looking at. But we live in a real desert, but also in a childcare desert in our region. And it's killing the amount of folks who are participating in that workforce because of the significant amount of folks who are, leaving them with abuelo or, the uncles and aunts and all of that.
Hi, my name is Farah Dilly, a student at the University of Houston and a CHIP intern. Oh, sorry. Ms. Harrison, I actually have a question for you. You mentioned parents' rights and very early on, and earlier voter education was discussed. How would you go about educating school youth on voting without scaring parents that may be afraid of their child being influenced to an opposing political side? Thank you.
So the students are paying attention. I can't tell you the number of 8th grade poll greeters I had that couldn't even vote, right? So it's not a matter of us influencing the students. In fact, we should be influenced by the students. Students have to be provided by law an opportunity to become registered voters when they turn 18 in public school systems. They have to have those opportunities in their high schools. And so I don't necessarily look at that as a conflict of parent rights. I look at that as civic education and growing great citizens of our state and our country.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience here? Yeah, feel free to come up to the microphone.
Hi, I want to thank you all today. I really appreciate this conference. And Judge Fawcett, you're going to run for president one day? And you don't have to learn a Bible verse, okay, if you don't want to. I can really appreciate this talk on education because we don't teach our kids. How do we expect to maintain a country like America? It's not important about, and guys, don't get upset, the football games. All the kids want, it's not necessary that they all be football players. What about teachers, doctors, lawyers, other professions? But if we have kids that can't spell democracy, how will they know about democracy? I'm all for teachers getting raises. The football players get raises. The teachers, educators should get raises. I'm a registered nurse by profession. And like the teachers, we always go beyond our duty of service. And I just don't understand why we're not teaching our kids a little more. We're a strong country. Our kids are not supposed to come out of high school not knowing how to write in cursive or, even address an envelope, stuff like that. I'm just taken back with all of this. And like you said, Judge, it's not about, don't ask me if I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I'm a human being. We live in this world. If we keep tearing at each other, our kids are watching us. What are they thinking? Here are the grown-ups. We're supposed to be teaching them and we're not. We're teaching them to have, you think your way, they think their way. You don't have to get along with them. That's not right. And other countries are watching us, and it's embarrassing. I really would be afraid to go abroad and say I'm an American. I love being an American. I love seeing our flag fly. But nowadays, it's like, what is everybody thinking? We all need to get together, be it Republican, Democrat, Independent, don't have a voice. Let's get together. It's awful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, so go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My name is Pooja Salhotra, and I have a question for all of you. And I know you're not from the Houston area, but every time I drive, I wonder what's happened to all that money that we were supposed to get from the infrastructure bill that was signed 2 years ago. Because I don't see any of the roads being fixed. Are they in your areas? Maybe it's just Houston.
I think a massive problem that we see, and this goes back to kind of my thesis here, is a lot of this money you have to go out and get. And I think that's an abysmal program because there's a lot of counties in the state, 90% of them are less than 50,000 in population. And so they don't have the means to go hire a grant writer. We were able to do so. But I think it's obscene that we have to hire a grant writer to go after state government funds that are our funds. Now at the federal level, there's a lot. We're applying for RAISE grants, the Rebuilding American Infrastructure for Sustainability and Equitability. There's also Safe Streets for All. All of these were a part of that overall infrastructure grant. It's challenging to get that funding. There's a lot of metrics and you have to, hire certain ways, and there's a lot of federal strings attached to it that scares a lot of folks. But when you look at the amount of money that the state of Texas puts in, we should absolutely be going after that money. But we see it in what we talk about in healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid in the state of Texas. We don't like dealing with the federal government. We're turning away Texans' money, and I think it's a shame.
And we'll take one more question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffanie Pico. I'm a student here at University of Houston downtown, junior. And my question is, how can schools develop a support system for mental health involving students?
I think looking at students as whole people, one thing that I find disturbing about public education is we speak to our most important constituents the least. And when we create these opportunities for students to speak and share, they have tremendous ideas and they know the way forward. In Round Rock ISD, we have invested in mental and behavioral health. We have 14 social workers. And honestly, I would like to see us invest, if not the same, but even more, as we're investing in targeted hardening for security like police and schools. We need to get on the front end and have mental and behavioral health supports mandated and supported and funded in every school. And that is absolutely vital, non-negotiable. And I think that was a wonderful question.
So let's thank our panel for joining us.